Thank you. The next item of business is the cross-committee debate on the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate. Please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Claire Haughey on behalf of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As convener of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, I am pleased to have the opportunity to open today's important debate regarding the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. Firstly, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the People's Panel for producing such a comprehensive report on the topic, and I would also like to thank all parliamentary staff as well as members of the Stewarding Board who helped ensure this process ran smoothly. I'd also like to place on record my thanks to all the various stakeholders who have taken the time to give evidence. The collaborative efforts of all those involved in producing this report has been invaluable. For 3 years, members of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee have worked jointly with members of the Criminal Justice and Social Justice Committee to examine how drug deaths and drug harm could be tackled in Scotland. Throughout this time, we have taken a holistic approach while we look at issues relating to drug harm, and I am pleased that the panel's report has captured how complex and nuanced an issue this is. The report itself covers a wide range of issues and highlights multiple areas for government consideration, both in the immediate term and for the future. I would like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his letter of the 10th of February to the conveners of the Joint Committee, in which he outlines the Government's support for the recommendations made in the report. And while I am unable to cover all points made in the report in the time allotted, I will be highlighting areas most pertinent to the Health Committee's remit. Before doing so, however, I do believe it would be remiss of me not to briefly highlight the extensive work of the People's Panel. As explained in the executive summary of the report, People's Panels help empower citizens to actively contribute and deliberate on key issues, enhancing Parliament's scrutiny with innovative and informed input from individuals and strengthening inclusive democratic participation. This particular People's Panel consisted of 23 randomly selected individuals aged 16 to 75 from across Scotland. Those selected then participated in 2 residential weekends at the Scottish Parliament and 2 online sessions in October and November 2024. This work culminated in a collective statement and 19 recommendations in the report. Only recommendations that secured the support of 87% or more participants were included in the final report, and I believe this approach highlights the benefit of People's Panels, particularly when scrutinising a topic which covers a number of remits. The recommendations reflect a broad consensus, and I'd like to thank the panel again for providing a strong foundation for future policy discussion and scrutiny. I would now turn to focus on specific points raised in the report most pertinent to the Health Committee's remit. The panel heard that many people are either unwilling to access support due to fears of discrimination, criminalisation or general unwillingness to burden services which may not be equipped to respond. In order to address this, the report recommends the introduction of a well-publicised single point of access for specialised advice and support, or an alternative provided by a third sector organisation. This would allow service users as well as families and friends to have access to immediate support and advice, simultaneously alleviating the strain on other services. Similarly, in order to streamline support for those in need, the Scottish Government must act to ensure all public and third sector services are enabled to share information, with all bodies having a GDPR-compliant information sharing agreement in place with server user consent. This would allow for easy sharing of relevant information, avoiding duplication and removing the need for service users to repeat their stories, which can often be traumatic and affect the consistency of recovery pathways. It's also important to note, to further improve consistency across services, that the report recommends that MAT standards should be extended to cover all drugs causing harm, ensuring that people have access to the same standards and levels of care. And finally, I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight issues around funding, namely the impact that short-term funding is having on access to care and support and its detrimental impact on the workforce. Indeed, the impact of short-term funding was also highlighted throughout the Health Committee's budget scrutiny, where we called for multi-year packages to be implemented to allow organisations to better plan provision of services. These calls have been echoed in the panel's report, which states there needs to be a guaranteed protected 5-year minimum period of funding for community and third sector services. And I welcome the launch of the Drugs Mission Fund and Fairer Funding pilot, which I hope will provide much needed assurances to frontline services. To conclude, Presiding Officer, while the recommendations I have briefly touched upon fall mainly within the health remit, it's clear from the panel's comprehensive report that a multi-pronged approach to policy making is required if we are to be effective in reducing drug harms in Scotland. Just as the People's Panel embraced the need for collaborative working, so we must too in this chamber. Cross-party and cross-remit working will be essential if we are to effectively tackle drug harms in Scotland and ensure that services are to a standard that addresses the needs of those who require them. On behalf of the Health Committee, I look forward to continuing to work with my joint committee colleagues, as well as members across the chamber, to effectively scrutinise and help tailor forthcoming policies to reduce and ultimately end drug harms for people in Scotland. And I remind members of my register of interests in that I hold a bank nurse contract with Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS.
Thank you, Ms Hockey. I would take this opportunity to advise members that we do have some time in hand at this point. I now call on Colette Stevenson to open on behalf of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee. Ms Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to speak in today's debate on behalf of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee on the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. I wish to begin by placing on record the committee's thanks to the People's Panel members for undertaking this challenging and complex task and for their considered report. I would also like to thank the members of the Stewarding Board for the invaluable support they provided to the panel. Members of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee have worked jointly with members of the Criminal Justice and Health, Social Care and Sport Committees for over 3 years now, looking at how to tackle drug deaths and drug harm. And also would like to put on record a huge thank to the clerking teams for all their ongoing support as well. This has enabled us to take a holistic approach to looking at all the issues related to drug use and drug harm. We tasked the People's Panel with answering the question, what does Scotland need to do differently to reduce drug-related harms? The panel's report covers a wide range of issues, and I am going to focus on the panel's recommendations on lived experience and tackling stigma. It is clear from the panel's report that trusting and consistent relationships are essential to helping people who use drugs to access the advice, support and treatment they need. The panel heard that services being delivered by lived and living experience employees gain consistently better outcomes. The panel found that involving people with lived and living experiences within the statutory workforce would reduce stigma, as service users would feel more comfortable to seek support from people who have had the same experiences and who can be seen as a role model. They recommended that more people with lived experience should provide ongoing support and aftercare in the statutory workforce. The panel also recommended that the pay and fair working conditions of people with lived experience needs to be equitable with that of equivalent public sector workers in the drug and alcohol field. I welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to publishing guiding principles for employers which aim to address stigmatising practice and to allow people recovering from substance misuse to flourish in the workplace. The Scottish Government is also to publish employability support toolkits, and these aim to support people with lived and living experience to enter and pursue careers in the substance use sector, including statutory services, and it is essential that the implementation and impact of these measures are evaluated. The panel's report highlights the high success rate of community hubs, and I have seen how impactful community hubs can be. Beacon's community recovery hubs in my own constituency of East Kilbride employ lived experience peers and embed treatment and recovery in the local community. Beacons also runs projects for family members who may be impacted by substance or alcohol use. These vital support services improve the health, well-being and quality of life of individuals and their families. An issue which runs throughout the panel's report is the stigma and discrimination experienced by people who use drugs as well as their family members. The report identifies some of the ways in which stigma negatively impacts on the recovery of people who use drugs. This includes not being able to access support and advice, not being able to access treatment, not being provided with a consistent standard of service, and not being able to gain secure employment. It is clear that stigma and discrimination remain as barriers to people accessing the help they need. Tackling this unacceptable stigma and discrimination is central to bringing about the culture change that the panel recommends. People who use drugs and their families should feel able to seek out and access advice, support and treatment without fear of judgment or criminalisation. The panel recommended that there should be appropriate... Yes, I'm happy to give way.
Emma Harper.
So thank you, Colette Stevenson, for giving way. So I'm really interested in tackling stigma as well. And as a former healthcare professional, I think it's valuable that we educate healthcare professionals that don't work in drug and alcohol services to obtain stigma education as well. Would the member agree with that?
Colette Stevenson.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'm going to come on to further training in terms of stigma and trauma training later on in my speech. So thank you. So the panel recommended that there should be appropriate anti-stigma training for staff across all public bodies, as well as those working in alcohol and drug partnerships, and that this should be led by and delivered by those with lived and living experience. Presiding Officer, last week, as I touched upon earlier, I received training along with members of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee. And it was on how to take a trauma-informed and responsive approach when speaking with vulnerable people. I think that all of those who work in the public sector would benefit from being trained in trauma-informed practice. The Scottish Government confirmed that it will publish a drugs and alcohol workforce knowledge and skills framework, and I am pleased that the framework is to be accompanied by training and learning resources aimed at reducing stigma. Again, it is essential that the implementation and impact are evaluated. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I thank the People's Panel members for their report. I hope that their recommendations will result in more people with lived and living experience being included in helping people with their recovery and bring an end to the unacceptable stigma and discrimination experienced by people who use drugs and their family members. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Stevenson. And I now call on Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I too welcome the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee in today's debate on the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. And I extend our sincere gratitude to the People's Panel members for their commitment to this complex issue and for producing a thoughtful and comprehensive report. And their insights are invaluable as we strive to address the multifaceted challenges of drug-related harm in our communities. And I commend the participation in Communities team and members of the Stewarding Board board for their excellent work in making the People's Panel happen. And I also wish to thank the committee clerk, Spice and other colleagues for their support in assisting the Social Justice, the Health and Social Care and Sport Committee and the Criminal Justice Committee work together in support of the effort to tackle drug use and its associated harms. So the People's Panel made a range of recommendations, as we've heard, but those pertinent to the Criminal Justice Committee are the ones that I'd like to discuss in some further detail. So the panel emphasises the necessity for sustained support for individuals transitioning from environments such as prisons. And this is to prevent the cliff edge effect, where support diminishes and external pressures resurface, increasing the risk of relapse. Now, we know how important prison release plans can be, as we hear a lot of anecdotal evidence from prison mentoring groups of what can go wrong and how easy it is for someone to relapse unless we have proper plans in place. And I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has accepted this recommendation. I know the Cabinet Secretary is aware of the importance of pre-release planning in this space. The committee welcomes the implementation of medication-assisted treatment, MAT Standard 5, that ensures that people receive support to remain in treatment as long as they desire, particularly during critical transition periods. And additionally, over £3 million annually is allocated to third sector partnerships, providing voluntary through care services. And a new national third sector through care service is set to launch in April this year, extending support to those leaving remand for the first time. Now, unplanned release from remand is a significant issue, and I'm really delighted this provision is being brought forward. And I would seek some reassurance on the longer-term sustainability of this funding. The proliferation of illicit substances, especially potent synthetic drugs, within our prison system poses significant challenges. The panel recommends that our cross-committee collaboration intensifies efforts to curb drug supply in prisons, aiming to create a safer environment for both prisoners and staff. So in response, the Scottish Prison Service has established an incident management team in collaboration with Public Health Scotland, the Scottish Ambulance Service, Police Scotland and NHS partners. And this team conducts problem assessment groups to provide rapid responses to emerging issues in correctional facilities. The Scottish Prison Service is also partnering with the University of Dundee to gain deeper insight into the nature and extent of drug use within prisons, and innovative technological solutions are also being explored to detect and prevent contraband entry. However, we must ensure we are striking the right balance between enforcement and ensuring prisoners living with drug harm receive the support they need. The Criminal Justice Committee has scheduled a formal meeting on the 23rd of April to deliberate on this particular matter, and I hope that this may initiate a further inquiry based on the panel's recommendations. The panel advocates for an expanded public awareness campaign regarding naloxone, a life-saving medication that can reverse opioid overdoses. The goal is to empower individuals to administer naloxone confidently, knowing that there will be no legal repercussions. My constituency team and I have undergone training to administer naloxone, and I, like my colleague Colette Stevenson, would encourage anyone to consider doing likewise. It could save a life. And I know that the Scottish Government supports this recommendation in principle too, and is engaging with partners to broaden the reach of naloxone distribution. Efforts have already led to a substantial increase in naloxone availability, with a 70% of at-risk individuals now equipped with kits. And while the increased availability of naloxone is positive, I am aware that there is still room for greater awareness and for use to broaden out even further. And I know the Government's fully behind widening access to and use of naloxone, and I would welcome a reassurance that this remains a key area of delivery going forward. So at the cross-committee meeting on the 20th of February, the Cabinet Secretary committed to providing an update on several fronts. First of all, progress on the single shared assessment. Efforts are underway to streamline assessments between the NHS and third sector organisations, ensuring cohesive support for individuals. And so I'd be very interested in what timelines the Government might be looking at for full implementation. Naloxone campaign developments. The plans are being formulated for a comprehensive naloxone awareness campaign, as we've already referenced, aiming to educate the public and reduce overdose fatalities. And I would just ask if this will be a sustained campaign going forward. And finally, GP engagement with MAT standards. Now, initiatives are in place to ensure GPs have access to and are utilising MAT standards information and training available online. But how many GPs are actually engaging with this? And will there be an evaluation to ensure this translates into better patient outcomes? And while I understand this perhaps sits more in the health space, the importance of access to primary care services can often be a protective factor for people living with drug harm and preventing them accessing or entering the justice system. So, to conclude, Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank the People's Panel again for this really important piece of work that they have done, and the Criminal Justice Committee remains steadfast in its commitment to addressing drug-related harm through our scrutiny work, in collaboration with our Social Justice and Health Committee colleagues. The insight from the People's Panel provides a very clear roadmap, and we're committed to translating these recommendations into tangible actions that will save lives and foster healthier communities across Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray to open on behalf of the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I continue to take on Christina McKelvey's ministerial responsibilities, I hope I continue to do so with the love and best wishes of the Chamber to her for her ongoing treatment. Following the recent publication of the People's Panel report, I welcome this opportunity to update Parliament today on actions we are taking as part of the national mission to reduce harm and improve lives of those affected by drug and alcohol use. I want to extend my sincere thanks, like those of the committee chairs, to the People's Panel, the Stewarding Board and all those involved in giving evidence for their dedication and the diligent work in producing the report. The People's Panel is a true example of deliberative democracy, as Claire Hawkey said in her speech, and that is evident in action. And I'm sure others in the Chamber, like myself, have found the report helpful and insightful. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all those across the Joint Committee, their staff and clerks for their work as well. I want to begin with a reminder of the stark reality that we face. In 2023, Presiding Officer, we lost 1,172 lives to drugs and 1,277 lives to alcohol. These are not just numbers. They represent individuals, families, communities affected by grief. Every life lost is a tragedy, and we must never become numb to the impacts of these statistics. Having met too many bereaved families, I certainly am not. The People's Panel report outlines some of the persistent challenges we face in tackling this crisis, and I'm pleased to confirm to Parliament that the Scottish Government supports all of the recommendations, many of which already align to work already underway. We should reflect on the successes highlighted in the panel's report. I would like to remind the Chamber that Scotland was the first country in the world to introduce a naloxone programme nationally. The latest figures show that an estimated 79% of those at risk of opioid overdose now have access to a life-saving kit, and I pay tribute to Audrey Nicholl and others who have taken up the opportunity for training. The establishment of Scotland's first safer drug consumption facility in Glasgow marks another milestone. It's still in its early days. Research and evaluation from similar facilities around the world has found evidence that they can help save and improve lives, reduce harm. Early anecdotal feedback has been positive from the Thistle, reinforcing the need for a harm reduction and public health-based approach. Also, as the Chamber will be aware, we have continued to put those with lived and living experience at the heart of our approach. This is reflected in the Charter of Rights, which was published in December, and the Charter supports people affected by substance use to know and understand their rights in accessing support services, which I think helps to address a point well made by Claire Hawkey around people potentially self-denying support, either due to stigma, lack of information, or more worryingly, because of a lack of self-worth. However, I know that more needs to be done. The People's Panel report calls for further and faster action on culture change, on stigma and on prevention. I will, of course.
Brian Whittle.
Very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary for giving me. I think this is an issue where pretty much across the Chamber there is a recognition that we have to work collaboratively. But I have asked this question before over a number of years, and if we're going to tackle this issue, and really tackle this issue, we need to understand why Scotland is such an outlier. And I've yet to get an answer. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary, if there any work being done to find out why Scotland is so such an outlier on this issue.
Cabinet Secretary.
This is a point upon which Brian Whittle and I have engaged. I think there is strong evidence that points to the direct correlation that there is between levels of poverty, deprivation, deindustrialisation and levels of drug and alcohol harm and drug and alcohol deaths. I think it's difficult to ascertain beyond that exactly why Scotland has had such a problem. What I'm focused in on, though, is the areas that can provide us salvation, that can provide a solution. And I think what we're seeing in evidence from the People's Panel report is an acknowledgement, as I was coming on to, that those areas of the National Mission, the broad scope of it, not picking one silver bullet, one area that will resolve all of these issues, is the right approach to take. And that is what I'm committed to. It's what the Government is committed to. And I'll come on to explain why that is the case. I want to assure the Chamber that the priorities that we've set out remain at the heart of the People's Panel report, remain at the core of our national mission and cross-government support. A key part of our response, and something that was a focus of the Joint Committee's work and evidence session that I participated in, is ensuring that we have a trauma-informed and resilient workforce to support people with drug and alcohol dependencies. In the forthcoming months, the Scottish Government will launch several resources to support the sector's workforce. These have been developed with our expert advisory group and will help set out the knowledge and skills expected of those working to support people who use substances, an important point raised by Emma Harper in her intervention. I will do in a second. The suite of resources will support learning and training and, crucially, support people with lived and living experience to pursue and sustain careers in drug and alcohol services and beyond, which Colette Stevenson rightly focused on in her speech. I'll give way to Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Alex Cole-Hamilton. I'm
very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary giving way. Scotland is blessed by some of the hardest working, most passionate drugs workers in the world, and I welcome his commitment to supporting them through knowledge and training. Does he recognise that they have a massive battle ahead of them as we see ever-increasing uptake of nitazines and other synthetic opioids on our streets?
Cabinet Secretary.
The challenges that we face because of the diversification, the toxicity and layering of the drug availability across Scotland is one that Alex Cole-Hamilton rightly points to. And I join him in paying tribute to those who work within our alcohol and drug partnerships. They are, as he said, remarkable. And those that I was able to meet within the Thistle, who have been picked and had to go through interview by a panel of people with lived and living experience, are absolutely committed to responding to the challenges that we face. In my recent statement on the progress of the medication assistant treatment standards, I stated that change is happening. I stand by that. Over the last few months, I've met with individuals and organisations driving this progress. Their dedication is clear. We are seeing improvements in access to treatment and support. We continue working to ensure that services are responsive to the needs of those who rely on them. And as we approach the conclusion of the National Mission in 2026, we are already looking ahead. Our work has not concluded. We have started consulting with stakeholders to shape the next phase, one that builds on our progress, remains rooted in evidence and is flexible enough to address emerging challenges. This plan will be shaped by those with lived and living experience to ensure it reflects the realities on the ground, and I will also seek to have cross-party discussions on this work so that we continue to lead the boldest possible response for the remainder of the mission and beyond. Presiding Officer, we are working in a challenging landscape. Alec Hamilton has referenced one of the reasons why. The latest radar drug surveillance report in January warns that the drug supply in Scotland remains highly toxic and unpredictable, requiring ongoing vigilance and a heightened response, a concern also raised by Audrey Nicholl a moment ago. This demands continuous vigilance and enhanced response, and we're working closely with our counterparts across the UK to address evolving drug trends. We cannot afford complacency. So I recognise that delivering this change requires sustained investment. That is why the proposed funding for alcohol and drugs has been increased by £2.5 million, bringing our total proposed funding, including Health Board baseline funding, to over £160 million. The increase in funding will support work around both alcohol and drugs and will allow us to go further and build on the national mission. The budget will provide over £112 million for alcohol and drug partnerships, £13 million for grassroots organisations funded through the Cora Foundation, and continued investment in residential rehabilitation. We are also allocating £2.3 million to support the Thistle Centre Safer Consumption Facility. This adds to the significant investment over the last 4 years, meaning I am confident we will meet the national mission commitment of £250 million additional funding over 5 years. However, transforming services and embedding new practices and approaches to tackling drug deaths requires not just increased investment or even structural changes, but a fundamental shift in culture across the whole of society, including through the justice system, as Audrey Nicholl raised in her speech. So it's an area where the participative approach of the People's Panel has added a unique, valuable contribution, and we're committed to addressing its recommendations over this period. To conclude, Presiding Officer, while we recognise the scale of the challenge before us, we remain determined. The commitment from across the Chamber in addressing the challenge is clear, and we will continue to act decisively, compassionately, and with a clear focus on delivering real change.
Thank you. I now call Annie Wells at around 6 minutes. Ms Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Across nearly a decade representing Scotland's largest city in this Parliament, I have spoken to so many people with a harmful relationship with drugs and their families. And almost every time the message is the same: they just want to stop. They want to end their harmful relationship with drugs, rebuild their lives, contribute positively to society and have a meaningful life once again. They want this more than anything. And yet so much of Scottish Government policy seems to go against this ambition. Everything is geared to making it easier to take drugs, to lessen the consequences for those who do, and to strip away resources from the people who are there to help them. That means fewer opportunities for rehabilitation. And eating away at the justice system, not least Police Scotland, who are the ones tasked with keeping drugs off our streets and out of our communities. So it is with little wonder that the People's Panel on reducing drug harm and deaths were so critical of the Scottish Government and its record on the topic. The panel, which was representative of Scottish society and featured participants of varying ages and background, were shocked at the SNP's lack of urgency in dealing with drug death crisis. They said the SNP government, which, let's not forget, has been in charge for the best part of 18 years, has not acted despite being well aware of the evidence. And the most powerful evidence of all are the 1,172 drug deaths, all of those a loved one, in Scotland in 2023, reaffirming our shameful position at the top of the international league table of drug deaths. Scotland has sat at the top of that table since 2018, and since the SNP came to power in 2007, the annual drug deaths total have increased by 158%, and nothing at the moment is seeming to get better. The panel stated, and I quote, that the same conversations keep happening with the same actions being agreed, but not enough has been implemented. And they added, and I quote, that there is no stability for service providers and users and no consistency of approach. They were severely critical of the Scottish Government for failing to keep up with the speed of which drug trends are evolving and changing. Presiding Officer, one of the themes running through the panel's report is that those who have a harmful relationship with drugs should be listened to, that they should help guide future policy and that they should be involved in new projects and support schemes. And I gather that the Scottish Government agrees that this is a worthy objective. Presiding Officer, the panel made it clear that they should be involved in designing new projects and support systems. And yet I'm approached by former drug users all the time who tell me the same thing. More needs to be invested in drug rehabilitation. There is too much pressure on people to remain on methadone instead of being supported towards true recovery, and there is far too little effort being put into tackling the root causes, like the environments where drugs take hold, like areas where I come from in Springburn, our streets, to poverty-stricken communities across Scotland. People don't just need treatment, they need opportunities, they need hope, they need a real way out. Presiding Officer, the families I speak to that have lost loved ones to drugs or supporting those loved ones through their drug dependency want help and support to allow them to help those that mean so much to them. Families and communities across Scotland feel let down by this government and they feel they are not being listened to. So will the Scottish Government start listening to those people and their families and the communities that they come from? Presiding Officer, the scourge of drug use right through our society runs deep. And understandably, we focus much of our attention on drug deaths and those who are in the most desperate of circumstances, socially, financially and emotionally. But in a report in the Scottish Sun this week, we learned that drugs are infiltrating other areas too. Last year, more than 3,000 drivers were found to have drugs in their system by police. And the most astonishing part of that was that the police only tested 6,000 people. So that's more than half of those suspected to be drug driving were indeed committing that selfish and dangerous crime. They need help and support too, Cabinet Secretary. And for context, the positive rate of those breathalyzed for drink driving was closer to 1 in 20. And drug driving now eclipses drink driving by 3 to 1 in Scotland. And given how high-profile and correctly reviled drink driving is, it shows to what extent Scotland's drug problems run right through society. And I was pleased today when the First Minister gave a commitment to look at how do we make sure that we put more focus on the drug driving, the way we did with drink driving many years ago. Presiding Officer, one action the Scottish Government could take right now is to back the Scottish Conservatives' Right to Recovery Bill. The bill would achieve a number of things, but crucially it would enshrine in law the right to access the treatment and care that the individual needs. It would immediately put a vulnerable individual whose life has been wrecked by drugs onto a positive path. It would allow them to hope, possibly for the first time, that they can have a future without drugs. In contrast, the policies of this Scottish Government are designed to take that hope away, to regard them as someone who is and always will ever be caught in the scourge of addiction. Presiding Officer, the panel were clear in their verdict. The Scottish Government simply hasn't done enough. It seems SNP ministers won't listen to opposition politicians, and they won't listen to the very best campaigners in this field, and they won't listen to the vulnerable users themselves. That being the case, I at least urge them to listen to the damning verdicts of this People's Panel report.
Thank you. I now call Carol Mochan, around 5 minutes. Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to I welcome the opportunity to open this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. The People's Panel on Tackling Drug Deaths and Drug Harm has produced some excellent work on analysing the current action on tackling drugs and around what more can be done to reduce drug deaths and to tackle problem drug use, which we all agree is a prominent public health issue. The People's Panel was set up to make recommendations to answer the question, what does Scotland need to do differently to reduce drug-related harms? This is an important question because Scotland remains in the grip of a drug death health emergency, with lives being lost needlessly. The tragic rise in drug-related deaths is a clear sign, I think, that the Government's plan to tackle the crisis is not working. We must have voices far wider than just the voices here in this Parliament scrutinising and pushing government, and the People's Panel is a robust way of doing this. I know in this Parliament every member believes every individual who has lost their life through drug dependency is a loss before their time, and it must always be remembered that behind every statistic is a friend or family member who have lost a loved one. And I pay tribute to all the friends and families who campaign across Scotland on this issue. However, despite this work, Scotland remains in the grip of this drug death health emergency, with figures remaining stubbornly high despite the national mission. Now, I recognise it is not a lack of want. I believe the Government do want this to change, but they unfortunately today have lacked the ability to deliver, and I think it is fair to say that the report confirms this. Society's approach to drug addiction must be evidence-based and should be one which shows compassion and kindness, and any solution must include the voices of those with lived experience. So I and my party support the engagement with the People's Panels and the recommendations to fully include those with lived and living experience in moving forward. To move government to a position of action, I think in opposition we have a responsibility to be clear and honest, and so I will repeat the figures that the Cabinet Secretary himself raised. I think that shows his commitment to this, that understanding the situation that we're in, drug-related deaths in Scotland continues to be the worst in Europe, and 1,172 people died of drug misuse in 2023. This is a stark reminder of the public health challenge we are facing, a stark reminder, I think, to the Government that they are currently failing Scotland on this issue. Put simply by the report, Scotland faces a significant drug and alcohol problem, and it is important that addiction services, both drug and alcohol, are adequately funded and supported. The report also highlights, in terms of funding and accountability, important points raised by the previous speaker. There is no stability for service providers and no consistency of approach, and the Scottish Government has to acknowledge this and give assurances that these recommendations will be an area that will be met with urgently. Presiding Officer, we cannot discuss the topic without acknowledging the fundamental truths behind the figures. We see vast inequalities in drug deaths, with people in Scotland's most deprived communities 15 times as likely to die from drug misuse than in the least deprived areas. Drug misuse disproportionately affects those already experiencing disadvantages and underlying social determinants of health, including poverty, homelessness, trauma and stigma. These all have an impact, and the panel recognised this. But they did also recognise this was wider than the remit. And I recognise this is no simple solution. But I do welcome the panel's report on which, the panel's report on this, which offers perhaps a fresh perspective on the very complex issue. The panel contains a collective statement, 19 recommendations across 5 themes, and the conveners have spoken on many of these themes already, and in the interest of time I won't go over them, but I do hope that other members might pick out some specific points. I, for my part, want to just give some feedback and general comments. Feedback from participants highlighted the benefits and effectiveness of deliberate engagement, and it was welcome to hear that the overall experience was one which was informative and allowed for collaborative discussion. The report recognised frustration from those on the ground, recognising the issue is not the problem. So it's not that the government don't recognise the issue, but rather its implementation on effective action. The government's subsequent response, I think, indicates that they don't see that, that they do understand there's a problem, but that they are not moving to action. And I think the report itself does, does include that. It's clear from the report that there is a lack of urgency on delivery from the government. I'll stop there just in terms of time. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. I now call Maggie Chapman, who joins us remotely again, around 5 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the committees, clerks and especially to the members of the People's Panel and all those who facilitated and supported their work. Both the panel's report and the evidence given to the recent joint committee meeting were thoughtful, sensitive and wise. Grassroots democracy is central to the Scottish Greens' vision of a fairer, safer and more sustainable future. Democracy isn't just about voting every 4 or 5 years for a representative and then letting them get on with it. It's about trusting people with decisions about their lives, their communities and their environments. Panel members spoke about the value of their deliberative discussions and about the ways in which they were able to reach consensus, contrasting that in a way that should give us all pause for thought, with the adversarial, sometimes antagonistic forms of debate towards which parliamentary politics impels us. The question that the panel were asked, what does Scotland need to do differently to reduce drug-related harms, is a painfully salient one, especially with the rise of new synthetic drugs such as nitazines, which carry increased risk of overdose and death. But as panel members pointed out, the question had really been answered before their deliberations began. The problem is not about finding solutions, but about finding political will and prioritisation to implement those solutions. It's not a matter of not knowing enough, but of not caring enough. Both legal and illegal drugs are used by people across society, by the rich at least as much as by the poor. But it is overwhelmingly the poor who are harmed by them, who are further impoverished, are criminalised, disabled, killed and bereaved. Poverty, inequality, destitution weren't within the remit of the People's Panel, and yet its members returned time and again to their reality. There are, of course, places in Scotland in which these situations are especially acute. One of those is Glasgow, where last year the Thistle Safer Drugs Consumption Facility was opened. It was visited more than 1,000 times during its first 7 weeks of operation, saving lives, both directly by reducing immediate risks and responding quickly and effectively to overdoses, and indirectly, enabling greater engagement with sources of support. I'm really proud of our Scottish Green councillors in Glasgow who have campaigned for this for so long and with such dedication. Another such city is Dundee, where I have my regional office. The challenges we face in Dundee are acute. They are closely entwined with experiences of poverty and inequality, of multiple deprivations, of people and communities let down by those who should have been protecting them. But at the same time, we have deep resources of fierce compassion, of care and solidarity. There is much quiet work going on, work that is transforming lives. The Steeple Church's parish nursing project began in 2008, with just one part-time nurse. Over the years, its nurses and volunteers have provided holistic support, especially for people who may have good reason to be wary of statutory agencies. And the Reconnection Project offers skills-based training workshops across Dundee City and Arbroath, including work with the RSPB, exploring and utilising the benefits of nature in growing and strengthening recovery. And I will return to the recommendations and the work of the Dundee Drugs Commission in my closing remarks. All the recommendations of the People's Panel are vitally important. They are set out within each section of the report in order of how many participants approved them. The very first, in the Participation Rights and Lived Experience section, with 96% support, is that, and I quote, "The Human Rights Bill needs to be passed by Parliament before the parliamentary session ends." That, we know now, and our disappointment is still better, isn't going to happen. So I echo the question asked by my Scottish Greens colleague Gillian Mackay. In the absence of that bill, how is the Charter of Rights for people affected by substance abuse adequately to be realised? Human rights are universal, but they are closer to fulfilment for some of us than for others. We know from panel members' own testimonies the stifling effects of stigma and silence. My constituents who are struggling with substance issues, who are struggling through poverty, through exclusion and indifference, know that stigma and silence all too well. This panel has reminded us of much, not least that drug harm is a matter not only of public health, but centrally and crucially of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton again, around 5 minutes. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I think it's been a great debate this afternoon so far. It's rare that this Parliament speaks with such consensus, but I think that we all want to strive for success in this. Because, Presiding Officer, as we all know, Scotland has the invidious claim to have by far the highest drug-related death rate in all of Europe. As we've heard the statistics, 1,172 people died in 2023 alone. Each of them a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister. Each death a tragedy. This is why Liberal Democrats are committed to treating Scotland's drug death crisis as a public health emergency that it is, and, if needs be, to appealing to Westminster to devolve powers necessary to the Scottish Parliament for tailored Scottish-specific solutions for what is clearly a particularly Scottish problem. It's also why the impact of drugs has been the key focus for us. I will take an intervention from Brian Whittle.
Briefly, Brian Whittle.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving way, and I wonder if he, in saying that we need specifically tailored responses to a Scottish problem, would he agree with me that to do that we need to understand what that problem is? And currently we still don't seem to understand why Scotland is such an outlier.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I think that's certainly part of it, but we understand, and I think through the work of the task force, through the work of the drugs agencies and charities that we all know, and we understand that it's linked to poverty, it's linked to unresolved childhood trauma. In some communities it's a rite of passage, but we still need work to better understand it. But nevertheless, I think there are particularly Scottish solutions to this particular Scottish problem. We know also it's why the impact of drugs has been such a key focus for Liberal Democrats in this year's budget negotiations, Presiding Officer. And you'll be aware that we know that through Liberal Democrat research that at least 1,500 babies have been born with neonatal abstinence syndrome since 2017. They've been born addicted to drugs, showing signs of that addiction through uncontrolled distress, crying, blotchy skin, uncontrollable shaking, because their mothers were taking legal or illegally prescribed drugs during their pregnancy. Investment totalling £2.6 million will now go towards helping and comforting those babies once they are born. And this is personal for me. This is why I'm in politics, because when I was a youth worker, Presiding Officer, I saw just how important these sorts of interventions are and how effective they can be. And supporting them is why I am in this place. My party also continues to be committed to measures that will improve public safety and save lives, including the rollout of naloxone. Like Audrey Nicholl, I'm one of the MSPs who attended the training session on naloxone delivery, and I carry it around in my briefcase and in my car. Drug checking facilities, heroin-assisted treatment, and diverting people caught in possession of drugs for personal use away from prison and towards help. I'd like to turn, if I may, to the People's Panel report on reducing drugs, harm and death. And I echo the thanks given to the panel. It is in an innovative way. We don't use it enough in this Parliament. We have used it before, but not enough. And I am glad to see it. I've long been a supporter of citizens' assemblies which could operate or would operate in a similar fashion to this panel. So I'd like to see more of this good practice. And the report, I think, includes some very sensible recommendations which I support. They make a very important point when it comes to the need for fair pay for those with lived experience who are working in the drug and alcohol field. At the moment, their pay and conditions are not equivalent to that of other public sector workers. That is a critical oversight, and we will see people burn out as a result of it. It is vital that the significant and invaluable contribution they make is recognised in their remuneration and they are given security of employment. Right now, many people with lived experience are expected to work on a voluntary basis despite the reported high level of success they are having in helping people. This often leads, as I say, to burnout. These people whose knowledge and understanding of the issues cannot be replaced, they are highly motivated to help make a difference in the lives of others. It speaks to their character, and we lose them from the sector at our peril. Presiding Officer, in the battle against drugs deaths, we need to empower all of those who are battling to save lives. That includes many voluntary organisations who do such vital work. Right now, life-saving services are constantly under threat or have to worry that their funding might be cut It is often only guaranteed for a matter of months into the future. This lack of stability has an impact on staff, on recruitment, on service users. It's a problem that drug services have raised with me too, and it's right that the People's Panel are pushing for progress because the level of funding certainty does have a direct impact and correlation the quality and experience of the practitioners that are staffing our services. And it's right that the panel has further added weight to the calls to divert those caught in possession of for personal use, people struggling with personal drug use, away from the criminal justice systems and prisons, awash with substances. I'd like to add my thanks to the panel members for their time and for the contribution they have made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate. I call first Eleanor Whittam to be followed by Sue Webber. Around 4 minutes. Ms Whittam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And may I too thank the Cross Committee and the People's Panel for their work in this area. I think, as Alec Cole Hamilton has just said, we need to do more of that type of thing. The People's Panel was tasked with answering a pivotal question, a crucial question. What does Scotland need to do differently to reduce drug-related harms? And this is a question that I thought about night and day during my time as Minister for Drug and Alcohol Policy. I came to that role 2 years into the Scottish Government's national mission to save and improve lives. And coming from a background working directly with people who use drugs and also being an affected family member, I could already see and tangibly feel the paradigm shift from treating drug issues as a criminal justice matter to seeing it through a public health lens, with an understanding of the underlying social determinants of health, all too pernicious in our country. I recognise the transformational power that lay in full implementation of the medication-assisted treatment standards, where people were to be empowered by immediate access to treatment, including being offered a range of choices and the right to make their own informed choices. This was a shift away from the all too often stigmatising nature of addiction services, where stigma and lack of autonomy had stubbornly felt baked in and intractable over many decades. And I encountered this time and time again whilst trying to help people to access vital services. Now, whilst there has been great strides in culture change and access to same-day treatment, and increasing capacity to residential rehab, we know that we have exceeded the target that we had of over 1,600 placements last year. But I recognise also that we need more of this, and we need increase in stabilisation provision as well. We also have seen flourishing recovery communities right across the country, and I don't think that we can understate the positive impact that recovery hubs have right at the heart of our communities. Yep. Thank you.
Briefly, Carol Mochan.
For taking the intervention. I didn't have time to mention this sort of point that you're making around rural communities and how she thinks we might be able to bring that more to rural communities. It's perhaps a little bit more difficult.
Eleanor Whittam.
Absolutely. In my own constituency, we have several recovery hubs, and they're instrumental in allowing communities to come together. And I think that we should help to roll that out right across the country as much as we can possibly do. We've already heard about the rollout of the naloxone provision and the opening of the Thistle, Glasgow's second but first official safer consumption facility. And we know that this has actually already been having such positive impacts. We've heard that since it's opened, we've had over 1,000 visits to the Thistle. But also over the last few weeks, we have heard that there has been emergency services called out on several occasions. But this tells me that it's helping to save lives, especially right now when there is a highly toxic drug supply in circulation. And I think that it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that people across the country realise that there's a really, really potent supply out there at the minute. And if that safer consumption facility hadn't been there, I am sure we would have had individuals who would have lost their lives. I also remain convinced of the need for more radical pilots, including drug testing, more and different models of safer consumption facilities, and the panel themselves recognise this in their recommendations and in their thoughts. The panel put forth, as we've heard, 19 recommendations that provide a strong foundation for future policy discussions, but I want to quickly focus on a couple that really chime with my own thinking. The panel strongly supports the passage of the Human Rights Bill, incorporating the Charter of Rights for people affected by substance use. This would ensure equal access to health and quality services, and I believe wholeheartedly in the Charter of Rights that was drawn together by the National Collaborative over many months. It should enable people to make their rights real, but in order for it to do so, we really need to have the underpinning of the Human Rights Bill, and this must be taken forward as soon as possible. And it's also imperative that we continue to scrutinise the Right to Recovery Bill. All ideas must be considered. It's critical that more individuals with lived experience form a large part of the workforce. As Minister, I was privileged to attend graduation ceremonies for those who had completed their training and are now working on the front lines themselves. This brings a depth of empathy and understanding that no policy can replicate. Empowering these individuals helps reduce the stigma surrounding addiction and makes recovery journeys more accessible and sustainable. And I really just want to briefly highlight that we have the dual frustrations that I have felt forever in an implementation gap and an accountability issue. And this is heard loud and clear through the report from the panel. We have brilliant policies, we have brilliant ideas, we have consensus, but we need to actually have the framework that's going to assess how they're being implemented on the ground, because it doesn't always feel like that to the people that are accessing the services. There's still much more work to do in that area.
Thank you, Ms Whittam. Just to advise the Chamber, the time we had in hand has now pretty much been exhausted, so members will now need to stick to their time allocations. No one better to do that, I'm sure. Sue Webber to be followed by Stuart McMillan, up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the chance to speak in this debate this afternoon, and I was lucky enough to attend one of the People's Panel sessions last year. Now, let's remember, however, that under the SNP, as Annie Wells outlined in her opening remarks, that Scotland has the worst drug deaths rate in Europe for the 6th year in a row. Our country's drug deaths rate is 2.7 times higher than the drug death rate in England and Northern Ireland, and 2.1 times higher than in Wales. Drug deaths have increased by 158% since the SNP came to power, and there were 455 drug deaths in 2007, compared to 1,172 in 2023. Every life lost is a tragedy, and these figures are truly unacceptable. Despite this, the SNP government have cut the alcohol and drugs policy budget for 2025-26 by almost £1 million in real terms. And it's little wonder alcohol and drugs partnerships, which tackle drugs misuse at the very local level, say they are underfunded and have no confidence in the SNP government's leadership. 72% of the ADPs say that the amount of funding they receive is not enough to deliver the national mission. The SNP must listen to the People's Panel and take responsibility and finally act with urgency to stop Scotland's national shame. The panel were clear that the government has not acted despite being aware of the evidence, and said the same conversations keep happening without any change in results. Having attended one of those panel sessions, there were two things in particular the People's Panel said that I agree with. The People's Panel were shocked to learn about the lack of urgency and implementation given the scale of the crisis, and said that the same conversations keep happening, with the same actions being agreed, but not enough being implemented. And the People's Panel were concerned that the evidence they have heard has been previously presented by experts, yet has not been acted upon by the government. There is no stability for service providers and users, and no consistency of approach. Those are remarks that Carol Mockin also made in her opening remarks. One of my main concerns listening during that panel session was that the same people stood up and presented with the same voices and the people as usual, and no action was being taken on these issues. We need to hear from new voices, those that are involved directly and have that lived experience of the recovery community. And there's clearly been reflected in the People's Panel's findings. There was very little talk of doing something more or something different or innovative, despite a cultural change and brave and bold action being required to tackle a public health emergency created by drug use in Scotland. As a Conservative Member of Parliament, this would include the Right to Recovery Bill, which has been backed by frontline experts and would enshrine in law the right to receive life-saving drug addiction treatment. We do not support the decriminalisation of drugs, and none of the report's recommendations advocated for decriminalisation of drugs. We believe that decriminalising Class A drugs will not help tackle Scotland's drug deaths and could make it more difficult for the police to stop the supply of drugs getting into our streets. Instead of investing in recovery, the SNP continue to advocate for decriminalisation, which will only flood our communities with more drugs. And the SNP government priority continues to be harm reduction. But let's remember, harm reduction alone does not reduce addiction. Relapse rates remain high. And when interventions such as supervised consumption rooms aim to prevent immediate harm, they do not provide a pathway to recovery. If the Scottish Government are serious about improving these statistics, I'm afraid I
Sue
can't,
Webber is just
Minister.
about
I'm
to
in my
conclude.
dying seconds. Can I finish my last little bit? Thank you. If the Scottish Government are serious about improving these statistics and the lives of those affected by drugs, they need to be bold and innovative and act on every single one of the People's Panel's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 4 minutes, Mr McMillan.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First, I want to remind the Chamber that I chair Moving On Inverclyde, a local recovery service, and I welcome the joint work undertaken by the three committees of this Parliament, and also my appreciation for all who took part in the People's Panel events and for producing this important report. Scotland loses too many people to drugs deaths. That's something that we can all agree on. 1,172 drugs deaths in 2023 are 1,172 drugs deaths too many. This was the second lowest number of deaths since 2017, with 2022 being the lowest. I know the Scottish Government is working hard within its powers to reduce drugs deaths, and the public health approach is the correct way to do it. And I believe that the adoption of the public health approach instead of the judicial approach has helped to change some societal views regarding the challenge society actually faces, helping people with drug addiction. There clearly is still a lot more to do. Now, the 19 recommendations and the level of support for each of them clearly highlights the engagement from the panel membership. And before I get into some of the recommendations, I want to touch upon the funding section on page 31 of the report. The use of, and I quote, a lack of urgency and implementation given the scale of the crisis, end of quote, was very much a stark read. Now, the Scottish Government's National Mission on Drugs consists of £250 million over this parliamentary session. This is not an insubstantial amount of money, and it also incorporates the investment in the Safer Drug Consumption Facility pilot in Glasgow, and the evidence is there in terms of these facilities actually helping to save lives. Now, one of the key aspects of the National Mission, which I welcome, is the investment in over 300 grassroots projects to help our constituents and communities. The public sector cannot do it alone, and a partnership approach between public and third sector organisations is absolutely crucial to help people, to help save their lives and help our communities. This is where the second half of that funding section chimes with my own views, and I quote, there should be more care provided by the third sector. Funding should be allocated accordingly and based on need. Funding should be ring-fenced and prevention should be prioritised. But finally, on this issue, I want to highlight the £150 million in the Scottish Government budget for next year, which some of us in the Chamber voted for last week. Now, I'm going to give further consideration of the recommendations again, but the following are some which I wholeheartedly welcome. Recommendation 2, the ongoing support and aftercare in the statutory workforce. Recommendation 3, the anti-stigma training. Recommendation 4, there needs to be consistent financial support and training for the workforce, especially for support workers and people with lived and living experiences. Recommendation 6, the continuation and consistency of depenalising minor drug offences and not imprisoning people for short periods. Recommendation 9, all bodies must have an information sharing agreement in place which is GDPR compliant. This is something that Claire Hawkey touched upon in her opening comments. Recommendation 10, the 5-year minimum funding. Now, the challenge with this is that the funding for this Parliament is not always consistent, as has been highlighted by the Audit of Scotland in their fiscal sustainability and public reform report, something we discussed in the Audit Committee yesterday. Recommendation 17, the continued support for people in recovery, such as supported temporary accommodation of key workers. Recommendation 19, the additional public awareness campaign regarding naloxone, something that's been touched upon already in the Chamber, and like Audrey Nicholl, some of my staff have already underwent that particular training. Our country still has got a long way to go to save the lives of our constituents who need the assistance. And I do welcome the People's Panel and also the work they've undertaken to produce their support. And I do also want to thank the three committees once again, and I'm sure this work will help shape the future delivery and also actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McMillan. And now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Emma Harper. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I begin by thanking those who took part in the People's Panel on drug deaths and the cross-committee work on this issue. For a problem as complex and wide-ranging as this, it is key we have cross-portfolio collaboration. The first sentence of People's Panel statement is, a damning assessment of the current situation. It reads, the panel strongly believe that the same conversation kept happening with the same actions being agreed, but not enough has been implemented. And they're right. Some of the recommendations made by the panel itself were made in 2022 by the National Task Force. The time for the talk should be over. Regardless, some of the recommendations are welcome, and I will discuss two today. Firstly, recommendation 9, which is to give continued support for the people in recovery after referral to services. I highlight Midlothian Aftercare Group as a positive example. It supports graduates from the Lothian and Edinburgh abstinence programme for as long as they need. The Scottish Government response states continued support is part of medical assisted treatment, MAT, Standard 5. And while it has been implemented in most alcohol and drug partnership, we need to ensure the spirit of the standard is being followed. The Public Health Scotland review of MAT 5 uses the retention of cases for more than 6 months as a benchmark. Knowing that addiction can be a lifelong battle and crisis can derail recovery, it should be considered how we can be sure graduates of rehabilitation are getting support in longer timescale. Recommendation 15, changing to a zero-tolerance approach, is also welcome. I met with North Edinburgh Drug and Alcohol Centre, who use a high-tolerance holistic approach, and heard about its impact not only in treating addiction and improving well-being, but saving money for other public services. Individuals with complex needs can sometimes be labelled as non-complaint or treatment-resistant. Services must meet the needs of individuals to retain them long-term. Moving forward, zero tolerance is a step forward. Lastly, Minister, we'll talk about funding today, but members will have seen the news regarding the funding gap of 450 million for IJBs and know the financial situation facing councils. They will be looking to make savings and provide funding to alcohol and drug partnership and services. We must be clear, there should be no cuts to drug and alcohol services by proxy. To conclude, Presiding Officer, I repeat the remarks from the People's Panel on actions needing to be implemented. Much has been done and much has been said, but it is meaningless if death remains high and if the organisations which prevent drug deaths are not properly supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Emma Harper to be followed by Sharon Dowie. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the work of the People's Panel and its excellent report. I also received a UWS briefing ahead of this debate from Professor O'Gorman and Gillian McElroy, so thank everyone for their briefings as well. Myself and other members of the committee obviously are grateful to the members of the People's Panel for taking the time and diligence to put together a thoughtful and direct series of recommendations on drug misuse and what we as a society could be doing better to help save and change lives. I can't do the full report justice in the few minutes that I have, but I want to highlight just a few of the issues they addressed and the effects we are seeing of drug misuse in our communities right now. And just to pick up on what Eleanor Whittam said about some interesting effects of some of the new drugs that we're seeing. Just last week, NHS Dumfries and Galloway issued an alert warning of sudden onset overdoses, where the effects of heroin contaminated with synthetic opioids are almost instantaneous. The street heroin is now being cut with nitazines, which is a synthetic form of opioid, more potent, more powerful, at around 600 times stronger than street heroin. So the consequences are tragically predictable. Overdoses are massively more likely. The effect of naloxone is sharply reduced, meaning that multiple doses of naloxone are needed to counteract the effects of an overdose, need more time to administer in a situation where seconds are vital. My office team were naloxone trained last October to give nasal or injectable by Ruth McCall, who's a specialist addictions nurse who works in NHS Dumfries and Galloway. So we were very happy to have that training. Many folks still see drug misuse as purely as an issue around heroin addiction, but the huge growth of synthetic opioids that I've just mentioned and the spread of illicit benzodiazepines and the speed with which these have spread shows that it's not the case. And others have mentioned we've got polydrug use, but polymethod use as well that we're seeing as a factor. So the rapid changes in drug supply were also highlighted by the panel in conjunction with the need to ensure those with lived experience of drug misuse, both directly and indirectly, are at the heart of decision-making around policy and practicalities. What also comes through consistently from the panel's recommendations is the importance they placed on tackling stigma, and that was part of my intervention with Colette Stevenson, and again I thank Colette Stevenson for accepting that. I've spoken about stigma in the past on numerous occasions here, and if we believe drug misuse is a public health issue, and I hope we do all agree on that, it needs to be treated as exactly that. People should not be put off going into treatment or even making a first step towards treatment because they fear judgment or stigmatisation or discrimination when they first pick up the phone or arrive for an appointment. Sometimes the judgment does occur when encountering other health services away from drugs or alcohol services. And I've raised this repeatedly in this place, and I've had ministerial meetings as well. And I've recently been pleased to find out that there is a brand new e-learning programme on the NHS Tourist platform. It has been created and has been developed in collaboration with persons with lived experience from the Scottish Recovery Consortium. So it's a free for any healthcare professional e-learning programme, and it covers stigma among other things. So it's so important that we involve and include people with lived experience in how we proceed. I will take an intervention.
Ms Harper, you're just about to conclude.
Oh, apologies. I would have kept let you in, no problem. So, just finally, Presiding Officer, destigmatisation is absolutely a key measure for helping people in the first step towards treatment. And again, I welcome this report and all the work of the committee members and the clerks and the panel participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Sharon Dowie to be followed by Bob Doris again, up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to be able to take part in this debate to examine the findings of the People's Panel. It's a relatively unique position that we find ourselves in, debating the views of members of the public as opposed to the usual experts, professionals or even each other. We all know the desperate situation in Scotland in relation to drug deaths, and the People's Panel don't shy away from the severity or the impact of the situation. But they also provide a useful and productive take on many areas, and those are the ones I would like to examine as part of today's debate. The group are clear that the time for talking is over and that action is required, and they provide helpful details in terms of funding structure, reducing stigma and the role of people with lived experience in the process of reducing drug-related harm. Can I make progress first? Some of this is already underway in Scotland in the region I represent. We have River Garden, Auchincruive. Those involved say it's not just the people who are being rehabilitated who benefit. The facility also has a positive impact on their families and friends. And we know that when someone with addiction issues has a strong network of supportive friends and family around them, with the care and stability that brings, it makes their chances of longer-term recovery far better. There is much talk about the cost of rehabilitation in its own right, but we should be thinking about the preventative costs too. If someone successfully rehabilitates, that can save money further down the line when it comes to reducing crime, cutting down attendances at accident and emergency, and potentially even the cost of a prison space. And of course, the most valuable saving of all is that of a life. Not just preventing a drug-related fatality, but ensuring someone has a positive, productive, enjoyable and worthwhile life. This, after all, is what most drug users want ultimately, to be free of their addiction and to integrate back into society again. However, we must also ensure that the money being spent is achieving the best possible outcomes. Audit Scotland has highlighted the importance of assessing where funds are going and whether they are delivering results. We need robust methods to evaluate the effectiveness of our spending and ensure that resources are being directed to the most successful initiatives. That is why facilities like River Garden Auchincruive in my area are so vital. Their model of recovery is refreshingly different, giving residents not just time to reflect and rebuild, but also the skills and support to reintegrate into society. And I would take this opportunity to invite the Cabinet Secretary to visit River Garden Auchincruive to see the great work that they do there and also the support that they get from the local community. The People's Panel also discussed other initiatives across Ayrshire, including community hubs in Kilmarnock, which have been running successfully for nearly 2 decades. The real value of such places is that those service users can speak to people who have had similar experiences and come out the other side. In many ways, that is preferable to units who, as the panel said themselves, treat such matters as more of a tick-box exercise. Presiding Officer, it is important to note the good work that is going on when it comes to reducing drug-related harm. It is, of course, an issue which is emotive and can be politically charged. We may disagree in this chamber about the best way forward, but we all share the same ambition to reduce the number of drug deaths which occur in Scotland. Bringing in the views of the wider public is helpful in allowing us to gain perspective and learn more about what people really think. There are undoubtedly lessons for everyone in this report. I hope we can use the best of it and help ensure that drug users across the country receive the support they need and that Scotland's regrettable position in terms of fatalities can finally be addressed.
Thank you very much. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Bob Doris, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be the final speaker in the open debate on the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. The panel, of course, was commissioned by the Criminal Justice Committee, the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee and the Social Justice Committee in which I sit. And the panel have done us a clear public service by considering and reporting on the question, what does Scotland need to do differently to reduce drug-related harms? And by and large, they looked for consensus, because they set a very high bar before accepting a recommendation. 87% of the panel, at least, had to approve to a recommendation. That meant 20 of the 23 members had to be in agreement. If only with that level of consensus in this place, Presiding Officer. It was also a representative panel, not just demographically and income groups and all that kind of thing, but significantly the recruitment process was to ensure that the People's Panel was made up of people with views of a similar distribution to the broader public opinion. So quite frankly, if they can get together outside this place and get a consensus, we can get a consensus in here without the party politicking. I would now like to discuss some of the recommendations. Recommendation 2, more people with lived experience should provide ongoing support and aftercare in the statutory workforce. Absolutely agree. The panel said it was to reduce stigma, it was to offer role models within that statutory service. And I think we all know from our work in our constituency the credibility that lived and living experience can bring. I welcome the Scottish Government response. It did note that the Drugs Death Task Force at Recommendation 129 spoke about a pathway to enter workforce for those with living and lived experience. It's talked about the imminent publishing of guiding principles documents for employers and employment support, and it spoke about a toolkit and a £480,000 fund. But I'm still not left with total clarity in how we take all of this forward, although it was very welcome. So I would ask, I think, how some of this would be monitored, and I would want an assurance that a pathway into that statutory workforce is not to stagnate within it, but a real progression pathway whilst within it. And I note that Recommendation 4 speaks about that as well. I'm keen to understand what cultural benefits there can be by refreshing the statutory workforce in that way, but I also want to, of course, make sure that increasing the lived experience within statutory staff doesn't undermine the provision of lived and living experience with the third sector within Scotland as well. I'd like to look at recommendation 10 briefly in relation to guaranteeing and protecting 5-year funding for third and community organisations to allow them to better plan provision, to better retain staff and to reduce uncertainty in that provision. I absolutely agree, and I do know that there has been some progress in relation to that. Special mention to Shirley-Ann Somerville in relation to the work that she's done in partnership with our Social Justice and Social Security Committee. There's 45 organisations now within a pilot scheme in relation to getting longer-term funding. And can I say to the Cabinet Secretary, good to see that working on a cross-sector basis to make sure we can get more of the organisations in this field getting that longer-term funding. I was hoping to squeeze in a comment on recommendation 17, Presiding Officer, which spoke about identifying how we support people in recovery more at key aspects of their lives, whether that leaving prison, ending rehabilitation, hospital discharge and temporary accommodation. Given that I've got 30 seconds left, I'll just talk about temporary accommodation, because we also have to ask the question, how do we stop those living with addiction getting into temporary accommodation in the first place, given that 19% of the 445,000 people assessed as homeless in 15 years up to 2016 had evidence of substance abuse. There's a housing bill going through the Scottish Parliament about ask and act provisions. If we think someone's at risk of being homeless, we should act to stop them being homeless. So there's active and live legislation through this Parliament by which perhaps we can do something already to meet some of the aspirations of the People's Panel, who I commend in my final few moments, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Doris. We move to the closing speeches. I note that Mr Cole-Hamilton, who participated in the debate, is not here. I will expect an explanation as well as an apology. I call firstly Maggie Chapman, up to 5 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank all of those who have participated in the debate this afternoon. It's clear that there is consensus across the chamber that we need to act, and that consensus is welcome. When I was on the Smith Commission representing the Scottish Greens, we were the only party calling for drugs policy to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Over the past decade, the need for that devolution has grown horribly evident. In its absence, for now, we must do what we can, and I thank the People's Panel again for illuminating the path ahead. In this debate, members have spoken of the report's recommendations, of their urgency in relation to particular issues and places, and of the ways in which those recommendations can and must be made a reality. It is heartening to hear the clear agreement from across the chamber that the panel's report must be a catalyst for action. Because, as the panel made clear, we have been here before. In 2019, the Dundee Drugs Commission published its first report, responding to drug use with kindness, compassion and hope. That report focused on key areas: the need for strong leadership and accountability, for cultural change that eliminates stigma, for including those with lived and living experiences in decision-making and service design, for comprehensive, holistic models of care, for prevention, for gender-sensitive and trauma-informed support, for measures that tackle poverty. The panel are right to be frustrated. Why has there been so little progress on the recommendations developed 6 years ago? Because many of the panel's recommendations echo those we've received before. Presiding Officer, we know what needs to be done. We need a public health approach to tackle drug-related deaths and drug harms. The so-called war on drugs has failed comprehensively. We need evidence-based measures, safer consumption rooms such as that in Glasgow, drug checking facilities, holistic support and a well-publicised single point of access for specialised advice and support. We need universal provision and policies, not postcode lotteries that govern services, support and prescribing practices in different parts of Scotland. We need to ensure equitable pay, fair working conditions and employment support for people with lived and living experience of drug-related harms. We need adequate and long-term funding, especially for third sector organisations who can reach so many people unmet by statutory services. We need justice reforms, including substantial decriminalisation and an end to the tragic spirals of incarceration and intensified drug use within prisons. We need education, effective data sharing that doesn't require already traumatised people to tell their stories over and over and over again. And most of all, I believe we need to recognise and fulfil the human rights of all, including the right to a decent standard of living, to freedom from the poverty and destitution which kill so many, including with the weapon of illegal drugs. The People's Panel has done phenomenal work, not perhaps quite the work that they or we expected. They haven't so much opened a window to a view that hadn't been seen before, as held up a mirror to our political systems, our institutions and agencies, and shown us our shortcomings. So I'd ask the Cabinet Secretary in his closing to provide clear assurances and timescales on when we can see the action on the panel's recommendations, because we cannot be here again in 1, 2 or 3 years' time asking for, calling for the same things. We need many more people's panels, as well as other forms of deliberative democracy, to shine a light on our shortcomings, our institutions and our agencies' failures. We need them to address the most acute issues that challenge us, but also, more importantly, we need them to challenge our assumptions, our exclusions, and our spoken or unspoken prejudices. Because then, with those people with lived and living experiences, we can create a better, more equal world that works for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call Katie Clark again, up to 5 minutes, please, Ms Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. And I'm grateful to the People's Panel for their time and engagement in considering this national emergency, and for the committees for commissioning the work. As Bob Doris said, the panel was asked to come to a consensus. And of course, that was a consensus on issues which had been identified as a national emergency for a number of years, and on proposals which had been previously discussed in this chamber on a number of occasions. So I therefore think this report is very interesting in terms of what a group of that nature made of it. As I say, this issue has been identified as a national emergency for a number of years, and yet the latest figures show a 12% increase in deaths from the previous year. As the Cabinet Secretary said, we lost 1,172 people to drugs-related deaths in 2023. And I think we all know that those deaths were preventable. And we owe it to the loved ones of the people who have died due to drug-related deaths to take immediate and radical action. And I think that's what this chamber expects from the Scottish Government. As a number of members have said, Scotland remains the worst nation in Europe for drugs death. An emergency of this severity is a result not just of underfunding of drug prevention and rehabilitation services, not just because of the criminal legal framework or even of our health services, but of a far wider societal crisis. The Cabinet Secretary accepted the link to deprivation. Carol Mockin spoke about the range of factors and the complex nature of the challenges. It will come as no surprise to anyone in this chamber that the people who live in the poorest areas have the mortality rate of more than double the Scottish average. The council areas which are bearing the brunt of this crisis are the urban centres and post-industrial heartlands that have also suffered the sharpest decline of their public services following the years of austerity. It's political choices that cause communities to crumble. People in desperate situations sometimes see no other option than to turn to drugs, and that is where governments have let them down. Both the Cabinet Secretary and Eleanor Whittam spoke of the highly toxic drug supply in circulation, particularly in Scotland. And I welcome the opening of the Thistle, the UK's first drug consumption facility, which I hope will prevent further deaths and create a rise in people choosing to move towards rehabilitation. But we have to recognise that is a facility in Glasgow and will do little to help those suffering from addiction outside Glasgow City, but also have to recognise the points made by Annie Wells, that this is a small part of a solution, and the real challenge is how we address the root causes. I'm pleased that the People's Panel has looked at the 19 recommendations and that the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary have indicated acceptance of all of the recommendations. But I agree with Maggie Chapman that the problem is that we don't know what it is not that we don't know what needs to be done, but of political will. Alex Cole-Hamilton spoke of the consensus. I think in many cases that is the case in this chamber. There is a consensus about what needs to be done. Claire Hawkey, I think, made a very important point on the need for multi-year packages, that it's impossible to plan if organisations don't know what their funding is. And Colette Stevenson spoke both about trusted relationship and the importance of lived experience, which was also a point made by Sue Webber. Stigma clearly is a very significant issue that the Chamber has looked at previously, and Audrey Nicholl spoke specifically from a criminal justice aspect, and as a member of the Criminal Justice Committee I am very aware of the massive challenge that drugs are in our justice system. This clearly is a complex debate, but it's also an issue that I think can't be one that we say we are accepting of what the Scottish Government is doing, because the reality is we continue to see the number of deaths getting higher, and urgent action needs to be taken to address that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Clark. I now call Brian Whittle up to 6 minutes. Mr. Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I rise on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives to close this debate, and I'm grateful, as others are, to the People's Panel and to the committees for producing such a comprehensive report. I think it has been a really good debate, and I think it has been very much consensual in that we all agree on the direction of travel that we need to go in. I remember very well the last debate in the last term of Parliament we had was on drug deaths, and I remember we voted with the Government, as did the whole Chamber, on a motion that included safe consumption rooms, even though I still have great reservations about that. I remember saying at the time, we can't keep having that same debate over and over. This is a crisis, and we're prepared to try whatever is needed. And I look forward to the report from the Safe Consumption. Of course.
Alex Cole-Hamilton. No microphone, Mr. Cole-Hamilton. I think I'm just going to... Mr Whittle, can you continue, please?
Sorry, Mr Cole-Hamilton. Looking at the things that were said today, I mean, I was really pleased to hear Claire Hawkey mention the importance of the third sector as an access point to services, and hopefully in time, if I've got time later on, I can go back into that. Colette Stevens talked about the lived experience to provide support and aftercare, and I think that's absolutely critical. She also talked about the stigma and the impact that has on those potentially seeking recovery and treatment, and that stigma that prevents people getting into employment. Audrey Nicholl talked about the transition from prisons and that pre-release planning, which is something that I've worked on myself. In fact, I was once again let out of Kilmarnock Prison on Monday. When we were in there, we were talking about this exact topic. It always surprises me when they let me back out again. But in that pre-planning, I think it's often the third sector who are so important in that interface. I wasn't trying to catch the Cabinet Secretary out when I asked him that question again. I think my concern here with the Cabinet Secretary's response to that question is it fails to answer why Scotland is such an outlier. We do know, as Alex Cole-Hammond talked about, the reasons often for abuse, drug abuse is childhood trauma. We do know the impact that poverty has and the deindustrialisation, but it's no worse than any other parts of the UK. Yet we are seeing a much worse outcome. Yes, I will.
Alex Cole-Hammond.
I'm grateful to Brian Whittle for giving way. Does he recognise that this is, as such, a particularly Scottish problem, and as such we probably need a particularly Scottish solution? Does his party support the further devolution of some aspects of the Misuse of Drugs Act to that end?
Brian Whittle.
It is a particularly Scottish problem, but my point here is that we don't know why. And if we don't understand the why, how can you come up with a solution? If I could just finish this, if we don't identify how do we prevent others taking the place of those that are in treatment? I believe very much in community interaction activity that is declining in Scotland at the same time, and I don't think that is a coincidence. And we need to tackle prevention along with treatment. Annie Wells, in a very powerful speech, as she always does in this particular topic, talked about those she met who just want to stop their relationship with drugs and alcohol. And when they're asking for help, they must get it, which is why the Douglas Ross's Right to Recovery Bill, which is going through the committee at the moment, hopefully will be a help here. It's not a panacea, but it is a significant step towards a system that gives that word that Annie Wells used, hope. Hope to those who are looking for treatment for addiction, and know that there is support out for them. Because when they're brave enough to ask for that help, it is so important that they get it then and there. It's not enough to say, yes, we will help you somewhere down the line, because if we do that, we will lose them. And I was really pleased to hear that River Garden in Auchincruive mentioned by my colleague Sharon Dowie, and she highlighted that impact, not just on those who are seeking treatment, but the impact on family and friends and that important support network. In my view, intervention and prevention must begin as early as possible, and it should begin with community. I agree that a drugs and alcohol prevention curriculum is needed, but that is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Along with the recommendations in the report, we need to make sure that our children are developing healthy lifestyle habits early. And I've always said that investment in education is an investment in health and well-being. I'm sure we all know community programmes in your constituencies, and I'm sure that we all know that some have a consistent struggle to secure year-on-year funding, especially for those addressing mental health and recovery, as was highlighted by Sue Webber. That is why I wholeheartedly welcome the recommendation of the report for a protected 5-year minimum period for funding for community and third service sectors. I understand the extreme financial pressure our councils are under, but when decisions on funding are made, all too often the instinct of councils is to bring services in-house rather than supporting services in the third sector, which unfortunately often fail to achieve the same level of benefit in the community. Over my time in this Parliament, Presiding Officer, I've been able to engage with incredible organisations that are able to reach those in the community the most. Those organisations like Ochiltree Community Hub, Centre Stage, Recovery Enterprises and Morbid Day Services, to name but a few. However, each financial year, their contracts and services are at risk. In closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd like to relate a point that was made to me recently by a founder of a community organisation in Kilmarnock. Briefly. We often talk about these groups as the third sector. This, she argues, does them a disservice. To call them the third sector suggests they are a lower priority or somehow less important than the others. Instead, she suggests the community sector would be a more appropriate title. And I'm inclined to agree, because if we want our communities to flourish and deal with the corrosive impact of drug addiction and other issues, we cannot afford for them to come third anymore.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. I now call the Cabinet Secretary up to 7 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the tenor of this debate. I think it has been almost universally consensual, and I think that's highlighted in the fact that all of us have supported the recommendations of the People's Panel. So I think on that the Parliament is united. I also believe in the contributions that have been thoughtful, and I think everybody has come to this chamber seeking to contribute to the response and the answer to the question that we're all posing ourselves, which is how we can overcome the situation that are being faced in our communities. I'm also heartened by the fact that we haven't had a policy debate. We have had a debate about how quickly and how universally we can deliver the services that are part of the national mission. I think that is of fundamental importance. I want to, because of the tenor of the debate, I want to do as best as I possibly can to respond to as much as has been contributed today. First of all, in response to Audrey Nichols' asks, but also the asks of the wider committee chairs, I hope they will have received the further correspondence from me this morning, in particular in response to Audrey Nichols' question about single shared assessments. Standards 6 and 9 require mental health and drug services to be joined up, and both of these standards are in the process of implementation. We're taking forward the joint mental health and substance use protocol published in September. I want to address the remarks by Annie Wells and Sue Webber together, because there were similar areas that they focused in on. Annie Wells particularly asked us to involve people with lived experience. We are doing that, and I think the interactions with the likes of the Thistle give testament to that, but also to some of the asks that there are with regards to people coming through into employment. She also asked us to do more around residential rehab. We were committed to 1,000 publicly funded residential rehab places by 2026, and Public Health Scotland figures show that in 22-23 we supported 1,033 publicly funded resi rehab places, and an additional 637 were privately funded. So there is progress getting made there. We've also seen a dramatic. I will bring Annie Wells in a second. We have also seen a dramatic increase in bed capacity from 425 beds in 2021 to a maximum of 513 in 2024, a 21% increase, which I think we can all welcome. I bring in Annie Wells.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I appreciate everything that's been done, but we need to move faster. And I know you're saying that the figures were done for 22-23, but we're not seeing evidence of that, Cabinet Secretary. We're not seeing people move through that system. So I would just like your assurance that we are monitoring that and looking at how many individuals we are supporting and helping through that process.
Always through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
We are indeed, Presiding Officer, which is why I'm able to point to the figures around the number of publicly funded places that we have been able to see. I also think that whether it's residential rehab, whether it's harm reduction, whether it's the support of our community and voluntary organisations through the CORA funding, which I'll come to, there is no one single area that we need to point to. And in that space, I want to... I'm not sure if Annie Wells and Sue Webber have been to the Thistle, but I would encourage them, if they haven't, to do so, because they will be able to see the value that the basis upon which the Lord Advocate was able to give her statement on prosecution policy, which was that being a means to attract people to enter into support services that have never interacted with services before. And the early evidence is clear that that is starting to happen. There are people being seen within those services that have never interacted with statutory or community services before. Carol Mochan asked about multi-year funding. I can say for ADPs, we've baselined an additional 19 million this year to provide greater certainty. And a point not just raised by Carol Mochan, but also by Bob Doris about the funding for community and voluntary organisations. The CORA funding, 5-year £65 million fund, over 300 projects provided with multi-year funding since 2021. And while the terms of the grants vary, it's often 3-year grant funding that's available. I'll give away briefly to...
Brian Whittle.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary giving way. I think this report calls for an expansion of services who are right now telling us that without more support they will not exist to provide the support they do now. So how do we follow the money, and how do we make sure that investment reaches those that are intended and are needed?
Cabinet Secretary. It's a necessity of all public funding that we do carry out that assessment, and there is ongoing Public Health Scotland assessment of the national mission in order to provide the salvation that Mr Whittle is looking for. Maggie Chapman reflected on the tenor of the discussions that we're having here, and the fact that the People's Panel give the space to take the political heat out of what is an incredibly sensitive issue. And she also reflected on the need for political will. I think there has been substantial political will from government, from Parliament, £250 million national mission, bold action in delivering the UK's first safer consumption facility, working with the Home Office to deliver drug checking facilities, the first national naloxone programme rollout. I don't think we can take these successes for granted, but I'm also not complacent about the need to do more. And so I, of course, understand the desire to see more coming through, and I will absolutely commit us to doing that as we continue to assess the efficacy of the national mission thus far and what comes next. Alec Cole-Hamilton, I very much welcome the Liberal Democrats' intervention and collaboration with the budget. Look forward to be able to visiting Aberlour's services in due course, and I also welcome his acknowledgement that this is a public health issue. I very much pay tribute to Eleanor Whittam for her time in this ministerial role and for her ongoing interest and commitment in this area, and the recognition that she made of the social determinants of ill health and drug dependency. The recovery hubs that she spoke of, I absolutely echo the need and the excellent facilities that they provide, and point to the Airdrie Recovery Cafe in my own constituency that does such good work in this space and really gives value and agency to those with lived and living experience to have an involvement in support of others. Again, similarly, Stuart McMillan spoke of the community and voluntary interaction, and again I point to the CORA investment that's in place. Faisal Chowdhury spoke of the need for cross-portfolio collaboration. I can give him an assurance that that is happening. I'll go one step further, and the fact that we need cross-society action, and for us to all reflect upon, in all aspects of life, how we are contributing or otherwise to the stigma that's been felt, to the narrative around drug dependency, and to those that have lost their lives. Because one of the things that I can absolutely point to, I'm sorry, I'm struggling for time, I believe. I'm probably beyond it, but I think it really helps in terms of Emma Harper's point, to really focus in on one of the successes of the national mission that has been relayed to me by some of those families that I've been able to speak to, is the reduction in stigma, is the way that people are now more willing to come forward and access services. I recognise and thank the work of River Garden. I will see what I can do about being able to take up Sharon Dowie's offer of a visit. And finally, I want to thank Bob Doris for his suggestion around the need for better consensus building. To conclude, there is absolutely more work to do. I recognise that. We are not at the end of the mission. We have to keep working hard to ensure that we reduce harm associated with drug dependency, and that we continue to do everything possible to save lives, and that is absolutely at the heart of the work that this government is committed to.
Thank you. I now invite Gillian Mackay to wind up the debate on behalf of the committees. Up to 7 minutes. Ms Mackay.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. As I begin to wind up on behalf of the three committees, I want to echo the Cabinet Secretary's sentiment and send the love and best wishes of the Chamber to Christina McKelvey. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to close this important debate on behalf of the Health, Social Care and Sport, Criminal Justice and Social Justice Committees. As we've heard, these three committees have undertaken joint scrutiny on the issue of tackling drug deaths and drug harm, and I thank all members of the Joint Committee for their diligent work thus far. I'd also like to thank all members from across the Chamber who have taken the time to contribute to today's debate and echo much of the sentiment raised. I too would like to thank all of those who have contributed to the People's Panel report, which provides a comprehensive overview of the current landscape of drug services and the issues facing service users and their families across Scotland. This report has highlighted the crucial role that lived experienced individuals play in driving change across Scotland, and I'm pleased the recommendations in the report have mostly been welcomed and agreed by the Scottish Government. I hope that this work will provide a strong foundation for change, and look forward to scrutinising forthcoming policy actions on the back of these important and comprehensive set of recommendations. On this point, I'd also like to take the opportunity on behalf of the committee to offer my sincere condolences to anyone who's lost a loved one to drugs. I'd also like to commend the bravery of all those with lived experience who've taken the time to share their ideas and experience with the committee throughout the process, and particularly those participants on the People's Panel. Their testimonies and commitment to collaborative working has set an excellent example and helped to highlight the benefits of participative democracy. The issue of drug harm and drug deaths in Scotland has blighted Scotland for far too long, and it's incumbent on all of us in this Parliament to work together to mitigate the damage done to individuals and families, with the goal of ultimately saving lives. This debate and the work of the People's Panel is a strong example of cross-committee collaboration that I hope will be emulated in the future. For such a complex and nuanced issue, collaborative working is essential if we're to make progress on the cross-sectoral nature of the significant challenges we face in tackling drug deaths and drug harm necessitates such collaboration. It is clear there is no quick or easy fix when it comes to tackling drug harms and drug deaths in Scotland. However, what is clear is that progress needs to be measured, and this Parliament will play a key role in ensuring swift government delivery on the many points raised both in the report and in the Chamber today. Emma Harper mentioned in her intervention to Colette Stevenson anti-stigma training for those who work outside of drug and alcohol services. I think this is hugely important and reflects some of what we've heard in informal sessions of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. Many of those who spoke to us noted how it wasn't always drug services that they first got help from, and ensuring all services are trauma-informed is hugely important. Audrey Nicholl, Stuart McMillan, Carol Mockin and Alex Cole-Hamilton mentioned awareness raising around naloxone and improving the numbers trained to use it. In addition to increasing the number of people trained, I hope the Government is looking at how to train as diverse a group as possible to ensure everyone who may interact with those who use drugs have the confidence to be able to use naloxone. Maggie Chapman and the Cabinet Secretary, as well as others, referenced the work going on at the Thistle in Glasgow, and we should collectively be paying a huge tribute to the staff there, who, despite some of the coverage of the site, are doing a phenomenal job. Alex Cole-Hamilton and others mentioned Nitazines. Emma Harper mentioned the current warnings in Dumfries and Galloway, and I hope that we can see progress on drug checking soon. Eleanor Whittam was entirely correct about the need to roll out more safe consumption facilities across Scotland. From my own perspective as a member of the Health Committee, this debate and subsequent report has been useful in highlighting the importance of ensuring everyone is able to access services they require. I'd like to echo the points raised by the convener in her opening speech. It's essential that a collaborative approach amongst all relevant public bodies is in place to tackle this crisis. A single point of access to specialised services would go a long way to reducing the stigma associated with accessing assistance, both for service users and their families, as is ensuring that GDPR-compliant information sharing agreements are in place to allow more streamlined assistance for service users. Of course, it's vitally important that frontline services and third sector organisations who play a crucial role in tackling drug harm have certainty when it comes to funding to allow for long-term planning. I too am grateful for the Scottish Government's commitment to strengthening this area and look forward to ensuring initiatives like the Drug Commission Fund and Fairer Funding Pilot are having the intended effect of providing these services with the assurances they need. As highlighted by Turning Point Scotland in their response to the People's Panel report, there has been a notable shift in public opinion and growing support for a health-based approach to drug use. This is most welcome, and I share their hope that this shift in attitude will be the impetus needed to create a system which is focused on support rather than punishment when it comes to tackling the drugs crisis in Scotland. I'd also like to thank the conveners of both the Criminal Justice and Social Justice Committee for their opening contributions and for highlighting the recommendations within their own committee's remit. I again share the sentiment and commitment expressed to continue our collaborative approach to scrutinising forthcoming policy, which by necessity will cross into various remits for scrutiny. As evidenced by the People's Panel, who have provided an excellent roadmap for progress with this report, it's essential we all work together to tackle this crisis. Only through cross-party and cross-remit working can we ensure services are to the standard required for service users. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would again like to thank all those who contributed to today's debate. It's been an open, honest and frank discussion, and I share the commitment made by members across this chamber to ensure that promises made by Government in the wake of this important report are delivered swiftly and efficiently for the people of Scotland.
Thank you very much, Ms Mackay. That concludes the debate on the People's Panel report on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. There are no questions as a result of today's business. That concludes decision time. I close this meeting of Parliament.